Welcome, my friends and viewers, to this week's episode of Legendlore, where I draw and talk about monsters, characters, gods, and other things from D&D 5th edition, all while giving a small but quickly digestible history about them. Together we'll go over their history within the game, how they're utilized in the modern edition, and how you guys can utilize them in your own games. This week we'll be covering the God of the Dead and the final third of the mortals turned gods, known as the Dead Three, Myrkul, the Lord of Bones. Getting right into it, Myrkul is the Faerunian god of the dead, decay, entropy, and exhaustion within the Forgotten Realms. Born as the mortal Myrkul-Themed, he was a prolific and skilled necromancer and possibly a prince, as well as a member of the triad of ambitious mortals known as the Dead Three. Myrkul, alongside the warrior Bane and the rogue Baal, both of whom I've covered in previous videos, cleaved their way through the plains to find the god of death Jergal and demand his divinity, with them succeeding after a tense game of knucklebones to decide the pecking order. While Bane selected strife and Baal the actual act and occurrence of death itself, via murder, Myrkul, the last to pick his portfolio, chose to govern over the dead themselves, ruling the underworld as a sort of Hades-like figure, and struggling against both the gods Cleric and Clerical to keep his seat of power. As a deity, Myrkul carries the alignment of neutral evil, wields the sole cleric domain of death, and his holy symbol is a white humanoid skull within a black triangle, indicative of a rudimentary hood. His portfolio consists of death and decay, old age, exhaustion, the times of dusk and autumn, and his worshippers consist mostly of undertakers, necromancers, and worshippers of death. As the mortal necromancer Myrkul-Themed, he was described as a spindly, thin man who wore dark robes, wielded a stave to help walk, and spoke in a soft, high-pitched voice. However, his ascension gave him a more intimidating form, appearing as a large figure dressed in fur-lined robes with a head made up of 4 skulls, speaking in a voice reminiscent of a person's last death rattle. In terms of my art piece, I tried to keep to this form for the most part, but I decided to fill the robes with more skulls instead of a hollow ribcage, as a subtle homage to one of my biggest inspirations for this piece, Nito, the First of the Dead from Dark Souls 1. In terms of his personality, Myrkul was fond of the idea that his presence created an unease in others, working to carefully cultivate a fear around his very existence, and ensuring that he remained in the back of everyone's minds. He was the end of the road for many in Faerun, and he made sure to remind everyone and anyone of this indisputable fact, being the god of all the dead. This suggests that Myrkul both had a sense of ego around his own existence and how it affected others, as well as a distinct joy in causing other people to be uncomfortable in his presence. He clearly was also forward-thinking and ambitious in his plans, even more so than the other 2 members of the Dead Three, with the best example of this being his choice of domain. Becoming a god of the dead meant that no matter how hard Bane made his people struggle, and no matter how many people Baal slew in his killing sprees, all those souls would ultimately end up within his purview, giving him a distinct upper hand in their divine relationship. It makes sense, given that he was a necromancer, and most wizards have to have an at minimum above average intellect. Where his abilities are concerned, Myrkul was capable of disrupting the life force of any living thing that he touched, siphoning away their physical and mental strength, and even being able to infect them with certain types of diseases, such as the classic mummy rot. He could also create and conjure any dead body into undead under his command, no matter the size or type of creature. In terms of his relationships with other entities, despite his manipulation and outplaying of Bane and Baal, Myrkul still keeps a tenuous relationship with them in order to help maintain the cycle of life and death, mostly out of respect for their times and adventures as mortals. While he also counted the goddess Shar as an ally of sorts, he was content to be viewed as an enemy by the more commonly good-aligned gods such as Shanti, Lathander, and Maliki, to name a few. But amongst his enemies, the greatest 2 were both Cleric and Clerical, the former killing Myrkul and usurping his throne at one point, and the latter taking rulership over his domain as god of the dead, at the behest of the souls of the dead themselves. I can only assume this is because Clerical is ultimately a lot more approachable than Myrkul ever could be. With that said, when it comes to Myrkul's worship, the Church of the Lord of Bones was never overtly large or popular amongst the people, which for a god would normally be a very big problem due to their reliance on the faith of their followers for power. Myrkul didn't really suffer from this problem, as he was a god of the dead, which is a primordial concept and a state at which all living beings will inevitably reach, even gods. This meant that he could draw power from all the souls as they crossed into his domain, which made him very dangerous but content to keep a low profile. He did, however, enjoy it when people cursed his name for getting old and having their bodies slowly fail on them. His worshippers consist mostly of undertakers and those obsessed with death, as well as necromancers who seek to emulate his mastery over the school of magic. As such, most Myrkulites, or Grey Ones as they're often called, were secretive in their faith and practiced in isolation, but were all dedicated to the act of ensuring that the concept of death was feared and respected. They were also made to study all aspects of death and undeath, if only to ensure that the power to create such things solely rested in their hands. Now, contrary to popular belief, this didn't mean that they performed sacrifices or killed swaths of people in dedication to their god, as one did not need to rush something that was as inevitable as death, nor did they need to fuel Baal's power with wanton murder. Myrkul preferred it that people died quietly in their beds, too weak to carry on but gripped in fear of finally meeting him when they crossed over. One thing that Myrkulites did do, however, was actively prevent or discourage the use of healing or resurrecting magics on those who were afflicted with disease or died, as their death gave him power, and to undo it was to steal what was now his. Some more volatile priests would even go as far as to infuse poison and disease into local populaces, if only to help speed up the mortal's natural process of withering away. It was also on special occasion that Myrkulites would conduct a ritual to resurrect somebody, usually of another faith, and done either after a long spout of begging was done, or a large amount of payment or tribute was made. I personally don't see any reason as to why a god of death can't be bribed. Now, despite their disorganization, in the rare case that Myrkul's church had managed to organize itself to such a degree that ranks could be formed, Myrkulites would be led by a high priest known as an Elder Doom, with the following titles being bestowed to lower members of the clergy. Examples of these roles could be a Deathbringer serving as a Myrkulite crusader, while a Withering Lord could be a high necromancer within the order, and a Bone Dancer could make a great title for a dervish rogue that serves Myrkul, and so on and so forth. You can get pretty creative with it. Beyond that, one of Myrkul's most dedicated orders were the Knights of the Eternal Dragon, a small sect formed of 12 Death Knight commanders who each controlled their own subsect of 12 Knight Rider acolytes. The Death Knight commanders rode atop nightmares, while their Knight Rider subjects rode gaunt horse skeletons, and they were known for conducting many great feats, ranging from the annual slaying of the Dracolich Zavarathemius to keeping vigil over Myrkul's very corpse after his death at the hands of Cyric. In terms of ceremonies and rites that Myrkulites observed, they did have very little in terms of rituals, with his clerics mostly praying for their spells at dusk, and their personal worship being conducted at night. One such ritual was known as the Dusking, where people were reminded of the world's collective mortality, and those who were not members of the faith would leave offerings to try and appease the Lord of the Dead. This could be a good way to have a cleric player of yours interact with another Myrkulite by providing tribute in order to avoid the gaze of the Lord of the Dead. Then there was the Bone Dance, which, despite its name, was performed by necromancers in order to conjure powerful undead, instilling in them the charge to protect a sacred item or location that was important to the church. This was more often than not graveyards or large ruins or tombs, and thus we as dungeon masters now have an explanation as to why these undead are running around all these dungeons. Myrkulites could even be contracted and hired as something called Doombringers, being paid a price in order to avenge the death of the client who paid them. Some priests would perform this act without the need for payment, instead seeking vengeance for the death of those that they had sworn oaths or service to. Other smaller acts of Myrkulites included performing last rites, offering comfort to the dying and burial services, as well as settling the affairs of those who had passed away in exchange for a skull fee. Imagine an undead lawyer settling your affairs long after you're gone. This strangely puts Myrkul's faithful in a respectful, almost trustworthy light, as the clergy has no need to lie, deceive, or otherwise manipulate others in the way that most other gods often would. They also even had a holiday similar to that of Samhain, where the veil between the land of the living and the dead was so thin that they could interact and leave messages for one another to find. In terms of canon artifacts for Myrkul, most priests would often wield something called a many-skull wand, used as both a badge of rank within the church and as a spellcasting focus for their divine spells. But the most well-known relic of Myrkul would be his own personal black wand, which was said to have been created to contain a piece of his divine essence and used to resurrect him back to life, should he ever find himself to be killed. It is clear that this may have been successful given the fact that Cyric did kill him and he ended up returning anyway. With that said, when it comes to role-playing and portraying Myrkul at the table, he commands a largely unknowable and frightening presence, but the party will come to realize very quickly that Myrkul is not a particularly ambitious entity. Compared to the likes of gods like Asmodeus, Lathander, Bane, and other deities who are keen to spread their influence and convert others, Myrkul frankly is just down to chill. He's the god of the dead and all things die, so he frankly doesn't have to do much work to maintain his power or his influence. This also allows followers who believe in his faith to emerge organically, forming admittedly small but devoted congregations that are more loyal and willing to do the work. If the party encounters Myrkul himself, he will have a voice consisting mostly of whispers, a very tall and imposing figure, and will spend most of his time extracting every bit of enjoyment that he could out of the PC's fear of him. If the party asks to try and resurrect one of their friends who has passed, so long as they understand the gravity of what they're asking and show the proper respect and fear, Myrkul could easily be convinced to let this one person slide back into the land of the living. but the second that the party comes to him with demands and arrogance, he'll do them all a favor and ensure that the party can very easily be reunited back together in the land of the dead, where he can torment them for as long as he wishes for their hubris. The guy's neutral evil for a reason. Now, in terms of classes that would be aligned with Myrkul, for artificers, alchemists once again sit above the rest as the best fitting subclass for a Myrkulite, brewing poisons and experimenting on diseases and rot in the name of the Lord of Bones. For barbarians, the two go-tos would for sure be the Ancestral Guardian and the Zealot. The second one is obvious, given it being the main godly barbarian subclass, but I could imagine a small clan of barbarians holding Myrkul in reverence, each of them connecting to their newest descendant in order to protect them and guide them through their lives armed with both wisdom and spectral might. For bards, a Myrkulite of the College of Spirits could let others speak to their dead loved ones for a fee, as well as perform burial rites and comfort others as they begin to pass on to the land of the dead, using their charisma and comfort to inform the victim as they transition. And then there's also the classic spooky College of Whispers bard, which can seek to spread the fear and demand the respect that Myrkul deserves. For clerics, while Myrkul primarily wields the domain of death above everything else, I could very easily recommend the Twilight and Grave domains as also being under his purview, given his focus on controlling the transition between life and death, as well as the veils of the realms of the living and the non-living. A Grave cleric who breaks the rules of the cycle only for their party can make for a very interesting character, as can a Twilight cleric who seeks to stoke the fear and uncertainty that Myrkul wishes to have. Speaking of the cycle of life and death, for druids, the cycle is actually very largely present in their practices and their beliefs, so any druid can be a Myrkulite so long as they observe the tenets properly. But if you're looking for a subclass to match the Skull and Bones aesthetic, Circle of Spores is really the only way to go. Although a Circle of the Moon druid who spends a lot of time as an animal and observes the eat or be eaten philosophy of life could also be very interesting. For fighters, any subclass can fit into Myrkul's ideology, but I always find myself returning to the trusty Echo Knight. A warrior who can summon a necromantic double of himself just hits so many points for me personally. And imagine an Echo Knight Doombringer who was charged with hunting someone down, and their echo being the ghostly presence of the person who was killed who they're trying to avenge. There's just so many cool ideas out there with this one, so I highly recommend that you play around with it. For monks, unfortunately, the Way of the Long Death is my only recommendation, both out of its mechanical basis and its flavor matching Myrkul's studies of the life force and its manipulation. If you want to have a little bit more of a supportive role, the Way of Mercy can also match for healing and harming. For Paladins, Myrkul's simple wish for death to be spread means that many oaths can be flavored to be in reverence of his tenets, especially those of devotion, conquest, and vengeance. Devotion Paladins can devote themselves to the cycle of life and death. Conquest Paladins can take a more zealous route in hunting down those who disturb the cycle, and Vengeance Paladins can make for very excellent Doombringers, charged with ensuring the death of their quarry. Now for Rangers, their mastery of tracking their foes and taming creatures can certainly make for excellent Doombringers as well, able to kill foes from a distance with ranged weapons and armed with hunting pets that can wolf down a target very easily. In this respect, almost any Ranger can fit, with the exception of the Fey Wanderer and maybe the Drake Warden, but I find that the Shadowy Gloomstalker, the Magic Hunting Monster Slayer, and the extra-planar-focused Horizon Walker all make for a variety of targets. And of course you could have the Maggot or Corpse Beetle covered Swarmkeeper for that good fear factor that Myrkul likes to maintain. For rogues, just like the fighter, almost any of their subclasses can also fit within Myrkul's representation. And while the Phantom and Assassin rogues may be the most obvious choices to go to, the Mastermind and Soul Knife rogues can also be very great choices. A Mastermind with 5 or so killers under his belt can curate death far more than a lone assassin can, and Soul Knives can de-summon their weapons to hide their involvement in murders, while also riddling their targets with psionic-based mental horror. For sorcerers, the Shadow Sorcerer is the one best suited to have ties to Myrkul and their lineage, possibly being a distant relative from the god's mortal bloodline, or gaining some dark sorcerer's powers because of his ascension and their blood connection. The Sorcerer's Hound of Ill Omen could also emulate Myrkul's shape by being bigger, furrier, and having 4 heads instead of 1. For Warlocks, the Hexblade and Undead Warlocks are the best choices for a Myrkulite. A Hexblade can certainly rise through the ranks of the Knights of the Eternal Dragon, and an Undead Warlock can make for a very excellent Doombringer by wielding Myrkul's terrifying power as an unstoppable engine of death and fear. And lastly, for Wizards, Necromancer is the obvious and best choice for a worshipper of Myrkul, given their focus on the study of both death and undeath and the god's past life as a mortal necromancer in his own right. Evocation's penchant for wanton destruction has them more in lines with gods like Baal and Talos, and the Abjuration School's focus on protection is directly opposite to Myrkul's beliefs. As such, I'd avoid these two specifically, but if you have an interesting idea, I insist that you run with it. Now, when it comes to running NPCs and introducing quest hooks that are aligned with Myrkul, you'll find that most characters who worship the Lord of Bones are very private, secretive, and not vocal about their faith, due to its largely negative, if not self-imposed, connotations. As such, most followers of Myrkul will be hermits, undertakers, gravediggers, grave watchmen, and necromancers, the company of which is often seen as unpleasant by your common person. But the exploits and adventures of a party can put them in contact with all manner of interesting characters. So have these grave tenders and hermits be nuggets of secret wisdom and information that the party would otherwise not have access to. If a party member goes down, have them be brought to a Myrkul-Aligned and make a deal with the Lord of Bones in exchange for their friend's life. For quests, the idea of the Doombringer and their promise to avenge target is very good for both PCs and NPCs alike, especially if the target of the Doomsinger's oath is the BBEG of your campaign. The party could also be tasked by a Myrkul-Aligned to settle the affairs of a powerful NPC, such as a wizard, noble, knight, or whatever else, outsourcing the work to them and rewarding them with the aforementioned skull fee that was paid. This payment could be made in the form of gold, magic items, scrolls, or anything else you want to get the party. Incidentally, the party discovering that an NPC that they have found to be particularly helpful, friendly, or otherwise positive, being a silent Myrkul-Aligned worshipper, could be a great reveal and addition of tension between them for roleplay, and a cool way to subvert common D&D expectations. No one's going to be suspecting the happy, joyous bard to be a death worshipper. Now, when it comes to magic items of Myrkul-Aligned aesthetic and origin, the theme of skulls, bones, hoods, and reapers is very easy to implement. Think of maces of terror forged like screaming skulls on pikes, bloodwell vials with a triangular cap and a skull inside of it, things like that. All the items below are the ones that I personally recommend as using rewards for Myrkul-Alites or loot found off of Myrkul-Aligned enemies that the party discovers. And finally, for a homebrew magic item this evening, we have the Stave of the Black Prince. This stave is made of a sleek black obsidian-like material with a pyramid seated at the top, and is believed to be the same stave that Myrkul himself used to walk and cast spells in his mortal life. The stave itself requires attunement and is a +2 staff that can be used as a spellcasting focus, granting a +2 bonus to spell attacks and increasing the spell save DC of the spells cast with this by 2. The stave also grants the wielder resistance to necrotic damage, as well as the ability to use the Accursed Spectre class feature from the Hexblade Warlock class, using your class level to determine the Spectre's hit points and such. And lastly, the stave has 3 charges with which can be used to cast the following spells by spending the appropriate amount of charges, regaining all expended uses on a long rest. These spells are also counted amongst your spells known without taking up any slots, and can be upcast using your own personal spell slots instead of the charges. And with that, that's Myrkul, the Lord of Bones, everybody. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and press the little bell icon to be notified of future videos. If you guys want a chance to vote on the comment that comes out on the channel, please check out the channel's community tab, and also comment down below how you guys have encountered or used Myrkul in your games. And let me know what you guys would like to see in upcoming videos. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.